Good morning. Before I start, I've been asked to make a few announcements. Whoa, I kind of feel an echo. JP, our terrific tech guy, is coming to take care of that. Is there any echo? I'm going to miss the echo. First of all, I want to announce that the parking vouchers didn't come in on time. So I'm afraid to say that if you came here precisely because you were going to get free parking, you're going to be disappointed. They just didn't come. They changed the old antiquated way you paid for that garage, which most of you can remember had a coin, a plastic coin that somehow the machine could read, and they've now done away with that. Moved into the 20th century. Secondly, there next Saturday is a meeting of the SOBs, or the Sherlockians of Baltimore. And if you want to find out more information about that, see Greg Ruby, who's sitting right there. And there is a website called Sherlock Baltimore that you can go to find out more, presumably, about Sherlockian activities in Baltimore. I want to welcome you to the 45th annual Saturday with Sherlock Holmes at the Pratt Library, sponsored by the 3 Sherlockian societies of that are scions of the Baker Street Irregular, the 6 Napoleons of Baltimore, Sherlockians of Baltimore, and Watson's Tin Box of Ellicott City. We're doing this in partnership with the Enoch Pratt Free Library. My name is Andy Sahlberg, and it's a pleasure to welcome you today to celebrate our 45th anniversary of the program. This program was started in 1980 by the much beloved dean of the Baltimore Sherlockian community at the time, Phil Sherman. Both Dan Thomas and I spoke at that first program. Since then, the program has been a major venue for both scholarly and whimsical presentations on the world of Sherlock Holmes and the 40-year account of Holmes's life and that of his friend and chronicler, Dr. John H. Watson. In 2013, the book Sherlockian Saturdays at the Pratt was published by the Baker Street Irregulars Press, collecting 28 of those presentations into the book, and it's sold out. I'd like to thank many of the Sherlockians who have made the program so interesting over the last 45 years. Many of them are no longer with us, though thankfully some are. Previous program coordinators include Phil Sherman, who started the program, Bill Hyder, John Four, Mike Burdan, Beth Austin, and Carla Koop. Frequent faculty members of the program include Fitz Brewer. Is there anybody here who remembers Fitz's great voice? Yeah. Cy Keller, Joe Sills, Marshall Pinnix, Chris Dickerson, Rosalind and Arthur Cheslock, Les Moskowitz, Bob Katz, S. Brent Morris, Deborah Clark, Evelyn Herzog, and Toom, who we recently lost. John Besh, who passed beyond the Reichenbach about a year ago, and Sandy Aleph most recently, and we'll miss them. We owe them all a debt of thanks for the education and entertainment that they provided us, and the effort that they put in that's resulted in us being able to celebrate our 45th anniversary. For those who may be new to the Sherlockian universe, we are adults who contend that Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson are real people, and that their adventures, though heavily costumed to provide at least some form of confidentiality, actually happened. This is called the Grand Game, which is a term coined by Peter Blau, who's going to speak to us later this morning. And as the mystery writer Dorothy Sayers wrote, it should be played as seriously as a cricket match at Lord's. We consider the author of almost all of the 60 tales to be Dr. Watson. In 1940, Conan Doyle's son attended the Baker Street Irregulars dinner in New York and was appalled that his father wasn't mentioned. He asked where his father fit in all of that. And he was told, well, he was like Watson's literary agent. We refer to the 60 stories as the canon. Hence, we are starting with our tongues planted firmly in our cheeks, and usually the wit runs high. Today, we celebrate Conan Doyle for the consistent role that he had in presenting the 40-year chronicle of Holmes's life to the public, whatever that role might be. The three Sherlockian societies sponsoring this program meet at various times throughout the year. We meet for lunch or dinner, where there is usually a scholarly presentation, a discussion of a Sherlock Holmes story, and a quiz related to that story. Our membership includes people who, as I like to say, are seasoned Sherlockians, and also people who are reading the stories for the first time. Don't be intimidated. Feel free to come and join in. If you feel like joining with like-minded people and have a good time, please come up to me during the break, and I'd be happy to let you know how you can get more information. I would be remiss if I did not express our gratitude to our partner, the Pratt Library. In particular, I want to thank Genevieve Purchase, the Deputy Chief of the Central Library and State Library Resource Center, Jessica Russell, the Administrative Coordinator of the Central Library and State Library Resource Center, the Pratt Library print shop crew who put together the fine printed program, and Bernard Smith, manager of the AV team, and his staff, which includes our wonderful JP this morning. Thank you very much. It's been a distinct pleasure to work with you. By the way, the Pratt Library figures heavily in Sherlockian history. As a young boy, Christopher Morley, whose father was a mathematics professor at Hopkins, would walk down to the Pratt and borrow a Conan Doyle book he hadn't read. He would read the book as he walked home to their house in Upper Park Avenue. Frequently, before he reached home, he had read the whole book and would repeat the process the next day. When he grew up, he became a novelist, an essayist, and founded the Baker Street Irregulars in 1934. Furthermore, in 1946, Richard Hart of the Pratt Library was one of the first members of the first 6 members of at the founding meeting of the 6 Napoleons. We could not do these programs without the Pratt, and I want you to know how very much we value your collaboration and assistance over the 45 years. So close the door to that magic portal and go with us to a world where, as Vincent Starrett said in his poem 221B, it is always 1895. Our first speaker is Peter Blau, BSI. Peter E. Blau, Black Peter in the Baker Street Irregulars, is the undisputed dean of the American Sherlockian community. The Baker Street Irregulars, or BSI, has an oral history project in which we interview members. In every interview that I have heard, and I used to run the program for a while, when the person who's being interviewed is asked to name some memorable BSI members, they talk about Peter Blau. They'll always say, well, of course, there's Peter Blau. And with good reason. Peter discovered the world of Sherlock Holmes in 1948, attended his first meeting of the BSI in 1958, received his investiture in 1959, and now is a consulting geologist and freelance journalist, the secretary of the BSI, and Napoleon 131. He first contributed to the Baker Street Journal in 1968, revived the Red Circle of Washington Sherlockian Society in 1970, won the Morley Montgomery Award for the best article in the Baker Street Journal in 1974, and for more than 50 years, he has edited and published a Sherlockian and Doylean newsletter, Scuttlebutt from the Sperma City Press. Peter is also a member of the Adventuresses of Sherlock Holmes. Peter still presides over the Red Circle of Washington, D.C., which is having a theater party for Ken Ludwig's dramatization of Agatha Christie's Death on the Nile at the Arena Stage in Washington for the 2 p.m. performance on December 14th, with a talkback with Ken Ludwig after the show. Tickets are still available at the Arena's box office, and there's more information at the Red Circle's website, www.redcircledc.org. Website postcards will be conveniently available from Peter and Carla Koop during the break. Peter will speak on Conan Doyle's I Have Known. Peter?
Thank you, Andy. If any of you really want to know what it takes to be a dean in the Sherlockian world, the answer is easy. Stay alive. So I need to start with some of the Conan Doyles I haven't known in person, beginning with Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Next slide, please. There we go. To whom we are indebted. This portrait was painted by Sidney Paget, who did so much to establish Sherlock Holmes in the pages of the Strand magazine. And if it wasn't for Conan Doyle, we certainly wouldn't be gathered here today. He was baptized as Arthur Charles Ignatius Conan Doyle. Charles for his father, Charles Altamont Doyle. Ignatius was his saint's name, a common practice then and now for Catholics. Conan honored his granduncle and godfather, Michael Conan. Now, young Arthur was just plain Doyle growing up and in medical practice, and eventually wanted to be something other than one of the many Doyles, and started using a compound name, signing himself as A. Conan Doyle. But he never used a hyphen in a compound name, so he's now D for Doyle in the British Library and the Library of Congress. Some of us, of course, happily refer to him as Conan Doyle, since that's what he preferred. I should note that St. Ignatius of Loyola was one of the founders of the Jesuits, and by a nice coincidence is the patron saint of the Catholic Archdiocese of Baltimore, which happens to have its headquarters at 320 Cathedral Street. You're now at 400 Cathedral Street, just half a block away, in case you want to pay your respects after the event. Now, John Dixon Carr's biography of Conan Doyle, published in 1949, was one of the first books I acquired from Ben Abramson. It's nicely inscribed to me by the author and the purveyor. The book was a grand introduction to Conan Doyle, but I confess that, like most Sherlockians of my generation, I paid little attention to him, other than following in the footsteps of so many of the Baker Street regulars and honoring him as the literary agent I also confess that my relative lack of interest in Conan Doyle lasted well into the 1960s, when I was living and working in England and attending meetings of the Sherlock Holmes Society of London. I knew that Conan Doyle's first son, Kingsley, had died shortly after World War I. He enlisted in the British Army as a private and rose to the rank of acting captain. But it never occurred to me that Conan Doyle's daughter, Mary, might still be alive, and it would be interesting to track her down and ask some questions about her father and her mother, Louisa, Conan Doyle's first wife. The photograph shows Mary in 1919. Her father had married again, and Mary had gone to work with him at a psychic bookshop in London. She was sadly neglected by admirers of her father's work until Georgina Doyle, the widow of Sir Arthur's nephew, the Brigadier John Doyle, wrote a fine biography of Mary, published in 2004. Now, Conan Doyle had 3 children with his second wife, Jean. Dennis, Adrian, and Jean, who was a child, was called Billy. If you'd like to know more about what it was like to have Sir Arthur as a father, I recommend the charming stories he wrote about the children, published in the Strand magazine and collected in a book called 3 of Them, published in 1923 and readily available online at Project Gutenberg and elsewhere. You can see the 3 children on the dust jacket of the book. Now, the last of the Conan Doyles I haven't known was Dennis. Dennis and his brother Adrian were the executors and administrators of Conan Doyle's estate as long as their mother lived, and after she died in 1940, they continued to manage the copyrights and live nicely indeed from the copyright income. The photograph shows Dennis and his wife, Nina Midvani, in 1939. Now, I did encounter Nina when she was honored by the Baker Street Regulars as the woman at their preprandial cocktail party in 1973. But by then, she was no longer a Conan Doyle. Dennis had died in 1955, and Nina had married again to Tony Harwood. And now for Adrian, whom I did meet. He had a colorful life and waged a lengthy war with the Baker Street Irregulars. Dennis had attended an annual dinner at the BSI in 1940 and was surprised and disappointed when his father's name was never mentioned during the dinner, except for occasional references to him as a literary agent. Adrian, however, was outraged and eventually threatened to sue Ben Abramson, publisher of the Baker Street Journal. Ben said that when he received the letter from Adrian's solicitors, Virtue and Churcher, he had stationery specially printed for the reply from his lawyers, Bagels and Locks. There are many stories about Adrian, who was far from happy that he couldn't inherit his father's title. Sir Arthur had been on only with a life peerage. You can see Adrian and his friend Douglas Ashe in a photograph in a story published in Life magazine in 1948. Adrian is on the left, as you can see in a second photograph in the story. Now, I got to meet Adrian in 1966 when the Marquis of Donegal then edited the Baker Street Journal, the Sherlock Holmes Journal, and an actual hereditary peer invited me to join him at the grand party Adrian gave for the opening of his home at the Chateau de Luçon in Switzerland. Adrian was older then, but still living large, as they say. Both the opening and the chateau were grand indeed. That's the chateau at the top. On the right, it's a proper castle built on an outcrop overlooking the Broye Valley, and there has been a castle at the site since the early 13th century. We approached on a winding road, walked across a bridge, through a sallyport gate, and then still outside the castle walls, walked round on a narrow path to the entrance gate, where on that late afternoon, a trumpeter on a balcony blew a fanfare to herald visitors to the courtyard. You don't have doorbells on castles. Adrian was proud of the chateau, shown here on the cover of the booklet. Nope, can we go back one? There it is. On the cover of the booklet given to those who attended the party, inscribed by Adrian. Now, within these ancient walls, he wrote to William S. Baring Gould in 1966, are the original relics, the crime scene papers, the notebooks, the manuscripts, and the famous black tin boxes of the man who more than any other was Sherlock Holmes. A century of time has passed into history from Picardy Place to Luçon, And yet there is a certain symbolism in the fact that with the old line doomed to extinction after my death, the relics of Holmes's creator should be finally preserved for posterity in the style of his feudal ancestors. Adrian's guests at the grand opening were welcome to tour the chateau, which offered a splendid recreation of the sitting room at 221B Baker Street. Commissioned by Adrian when he was unable to acquire the sitting room that was exhibited at Abbey House during the Festival of Britain in 1951, as well as a proper dungeon, which contained an Iron Maiden of Nuremberg, as well as other instruments of torture. And Donegal wisely suggested that we not tell Adrian that I was a member of the Baker Street Irregulars. And I happily complied. Now, there were cocktails and hors d'oeuvres in the Hall of Knights, where Adrian displayed his collection of armor and weapons. Now, the hall was large enough to contain in a corner, not a grand piano, but rather a knight's suit of armor, seated on a horse, which was in turn armored. Then, because there was as yet no working kitchen in the castle, the guests drove off to dinner that Adrian had arranged at the Auberge de la Couronne in Luçon. It was, all in all, a party not to be forgotten. Now, my copy of the dinner menu is signed by my table mates, Captain Carl Wiensfeld, John Murray, as in the publisher of Sherlock Holmes, Maureen Donegal, the Marquis of Donegal, and June W. Johnson. Now, when I showed this image at a Sherlockian conference in Switzerland, I confessed that I had no memory of just who Captain Carl Wiensfeld was, and was told by one of the Swiss Sherlockians there, that's the boyfriend of Adrian's wife, Anna. Now, one more story about Adrian. When I met Georgina Doyle, after a biography of Mary Conan Doyle had been published, I asked her a question I recommend to anybody who meets the author of a biography. Tell me a story that's not in the book. Georgina thought for a moment and recalled that when she went to Adrian's funeral in Switzerland, she was greeted by a handsome lady who said, I'm Aude Loring, Adrian's last mistress. She was a handsome lady, and you can see rather more of her if you watch the film Adventures of Gerard, in which she played Madeline, the mistress of Marshal Marcina. I didn't get to meet her. There were too many people at the party. Finally, there's Jean Conan Doyle, the only one of the three children who ever had a paying job. Dennis and Adrian never shared with Jean any of the income from the copyrights. By the end of World War II, she was Air Commandant of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force and was knighted, named by Queen Elizabeth. Eventually, Jean married Air Marshal Sir Geoffrey Bromett, so she also had the title Lady Bromett, but in the Sherlockian world, she preferred to be known as Dame Jean Conan Doyle. And she was indeed known in the Sherlockian world because in the 1970s, the US copyright laws were changed and authors' children could reclaim their parents' copyright. John Lellenberg put together a motley crew called the American Friends of Dame Jean Conan Doyle, and I was a member, helped her reclaim her father's copyright in the US. She began being paid by publishers and by producers of films and television series, and for the first time in her life, benefited from her father's work. Dame Jean was a charming lady, and I'm happy to remember having tea with her and her husband Jeff at their home in the Romney Marshes in Sussex. She also had a flat in London, and one day walked out of her apartment to see Michael Caine coming out of the apartment across the building. Now, according to Caine, the apartment had been rented for him while he was in London filming without a crew, and the nice lady recognized him and said, "You're playing Sherlock Holmes. My father wrote about him." And figuring she's just another dotty old lady, Michael Caine replied, "That's very nice, dear," and left for work. Now, Dame Jean had a delightful sense of humor, but didn't really understand how things worked in the 20th century. When the Fox movie tone interview with Conan Doyle was rescued from the Fox archives, I had an 8mm copy made for her, and she happily showed it to friends in her apartment. But it took 2 years before she realized that it was sound on film and was able to hear her father's voice again. In 1991, she was one of the first 6 women to be honored as full members of the Baker Street Regulars. As a certain gracious lady, she was a good and gracious friend and the last of the Conan Doyles, and I'm glad to have known at least some of them. Now, I'm sorry I don't have time to talk about the Conan Doyle Estate Limited Liability Corporation and its trials and tribulations. All you need to do is invite me back. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter, and we will invite you back. And as you can tell from Peter's presentation, there's more to being the dean of the American Sherlockian community than just surviving. Daniel Thomas, Godfrey Norton in the Baker Street Irregulars, is our next speaker. Dan is a trial attorney practicing in the Baltimore metropolitan area, specializing in complex family law litigation. The Sherlockian who started this program, Phil Sherman, used to say every year that Dan torn asunder what the good Lord had brought together. Dan has spoken at 44 of these 45 programs, including, as I mentioned before, the first one. Reintroduced to Sherlock Holmes in the 1980s by Phil Sherman, Dan served as Gasagine 20 of the 6 Napoleons. In the tradition of Ronald Knox, he plays the grand game and has embarked upon a campaign to instill in followers of the canon the conviction that Sherlock Holmes lived and still lives, tending his bees on the slopes of the Sussex Downs. Dan refuses to believe that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was anything more than a literary agent for Dr. Watson. And Dan will speak on, appropriately, Conan Doyle and British divorce. Dan?
If you're wondering why I'm not jumping up the steps, I am on the road to recovery from a broken hip. In any event, I was quite concerned when I understood I was following the living legend. And I was ready to disembark from the pleasure of making a talk this year. But in any event, I'm happy. Oh, this is going to be fun. I'm happy to be here. Love the subject about which I'm about to speak. Divorce has been a part of my life, an integral part of my life and well-being for over 4 decades. Before we get to the juicy part of this, I think we've got to get some background as to what is divorce, what was divorce in Conan Doyle's time, what he did. Then we can hit what Conan Doyle felt about the whole deal and what he did or couldn't do in order to get things on the reform tour. There are 2 types of divorce. First, there's the divorce a mensa et thero, that is a limited divorce. This is a judicial rendition giving the parties the right to live separate and, if appropriate, spouses a right to support one from the other. It may also specify the rights and duties of the parties relating to a minor child of the marriage. It did not sever the marital bond, and the rights of inheritance from one to the other upon death was not affected. Then there is a second type of divorce, the divorce a vinculo matrimoni, or the absolute divorce. It is a divorce that severs the marital relationship and generally allows both parties to remarry. Under English common law, the ecclesiastical courts were empowered to award only a limited divorce. If an absolute divorce were sought, there was no court in England that could solve the problem. It was necessary that the wronged party would seek the passage of a bill of divorcement by the House of Commons as completely severing the marital bond. Naturally, it was only available to the well-fixed financially or the well-placed politically who could travel that road. That remained the case until the enactment of the Divorce and Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857. That legislation takes divorce litigation from the ecclesiastical courts to the civil courts, making a civil or secular divorce possible. The act allowed the grant of a limited divorce on the grounds of adultery, cruelty, and desertion. Further, adultery could also provide grounds for an absolute divorce. The simple act of adultery for a wife, proven by the husband, constituted sufficient grounds for rendition of such an award. However, the wife, a second-class citizen, if she was to succeed in her quest for finality, she not only had to prove that the husband was an adulterer, she had the additional burden to combine it with another offense, such as incest, cruelty, bigamy, or desertion. This double standard remained in effect until 1932. Also, under the 1857 Act, if the wife was deserted by a husband, she was given an opportunity to protect her income and property from her husband and his creditors upon applying to a court magistrate for appropriate relief. However, in its normal treatment of the female spouse, that right was substantially reduced in subsequent litigation in 1864. This was the legal backdrop upon which the subject matter in which we're interested, the late 19th century and early 20th century. Before addressing the portion of our subject directly, it may prove helpful to look at Doyle's alter ego, Mr. Sherlock Holmes. There are but two adventures in which divorce is mentioned by name: The Hound of the Baskervilles and The Adventure of the Devil's Foot. The first of these reference divorce was, of course, The Hound, and refers to Laura Lyons. There is nothing contained in the narrative to indicate a point of view of the writer pertaining to the divorce at hand. It merely states that Laura's black-hearted husband had deserted her, and she might seek a divorce so as to be available to marry the owner of the Hound, which she believed to be a widower. The Adventure of the Devil's Foot is a different case altogether. There, we hear from the narrator commentary upon the situation as a reason he extended clemency to Mr. or Dr. Sterndale for the murder of Brenda Tregennis's brother. Sterndale speaks first. Quote, "For years I have loved her. For years she has loved me. It has brought me close to the one thing I love and dear to me. I could not marry her, for I have a wife who has left me for years, and whom, by the deplorable laws of England, I could not divorce. For years Brenda waited, for years I waited." And providing the lovesick doctor from running to and by bury himself in the Central Africa, Holmes allowed this and said this as follows: "I have never loved Watson, but if I did, and if the woman I loved had met such, and I might act even as our lawless lion hunter did. Who knows?" And now we turn to Doyle himself. The divorce playing field is that laid forth by the Act of Congress of 1857. An article reporting on a strange symposium of prominent persons intend to describe the most important action they would take if they had the absolute power, for one day had this to say: "If Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was given supreme power, and a power as great as both the Houses of Parliament, for a single day, he would exercise it in the direction of the reform of the divorce laws. The divorce laws," Doyle writes, "are so arranged at present that the divorce is practically impossible for a poor man or a poor woman. Those people have lived without hope and and are bound to lunatics, drunkards, and criminals. And great numbers, more than 200,000 of these people, are separated by law, but yet are not free to remarry again, a fact which cannot be conducive to public morality. The 200,000 British men and women who were separated but could not remarry and obtain a final, because of not being able to obtain a final divorce, became the rallying cry of Doyle for speeches seeking divorce reform. Doyle authored and published in 1909 a book entitled Divorce Reform, espousing the establishment of a royal commission. Ultimately, a royal commission on divorce was formed in 1912. As the president of the Divorce Law Reform Union, he enjoyed lively interplay with its members for years of its existence. Ultimately, some reforms did take place. As previously pointed out, the Marital Act of 1923 placed spouses on an equal playing field as far as alimony and divorce were concerned. I think we can reasonably assume Doyle's presence in the news media on the grounds of divorce reform contributed to the passage of that law. Doyle died on July 7th, 1930. In 1937, additional grounds for absolute divorce were acted upon, namely unlawful desertion for 3 years, cruelty, incurable insanity, incest, and sodomy. In 1969, an absolute divorce could be granted when the marriage was irreconcilably broken down, if both parties agreed to the separation after the separation of 2 years, or 5 years if only one party made the allegation. Finally, in 2020, as it stands today, so long as the parties have been married for 1 year, either party can obtain an absolute divorce from the other by merely stating the marriage is irreconcilably broken down. As an aside, Maryland's divorce history closely monitors that of England in many regards. By statute, Maryland adopted English common law as its own, as it existed at the time we left the mother country. Although English law authorized ecclesiastical courts to grant a limited divorce at the time, Maryland had no other ecclesiastical courts. Therefore, divorce could only be granted through the Maryland legislature. By Chapter 262 of the Acts of 1841, equity courts were given the power to divorce parties. Unfortunately, an early case held, even though we had no ecclesiastical courts at the time of divorce in England, the principles of those courts governed our own laws. That holding made for some confusing and conflicting decisions since the ecclesiastical courts of England could only grant a limited divorce. By statute of 1872, that problem was solved by granting unconditionally the courts of equity that grant an absolute divorce. As in England, grounds for limited divorce and absolute divorce have evolved over the years in Maryland. First, providing only fault grounds for divorce, such as adultery, desertion, cruelty of treatment, etc. Later on, no fault grounds for divorce was enacted, such as voluntary separation and strict separation. Subsequently, legislation added strict no fault ground for divorce, irreconcilable differences. Later, all fault grounds for divorce were eliminated, and now there are and only strict no fault and separation are grounds in Maryland. Finally, in the future, the limited divorce has been abolished in this state. For sometimes I questioned the genuineness of Doyle's mission to reform British's divorce laws. That concern is for the support for divorce reform arises from two sources. Firstly, it was well known that while he was married to his first wife and mother of his two eldest children, Louisa, on March 15, 1897, Doyle met and fell over heels in love with Jean Lickey, a woman in her early 20s, Doyle being 38 at the time. She was everything Louisa was not. She had an exceptionally fine intellect. She was a skilled conversationist. She was healthy, and you'll love this. She was well-trained opera singer. In effect, the personification of the woman in the Sherlock Holmes adventure. And after all of this, Jean was also said to had a delightful speaking voice and strong magnetic attraction for animals and birds. What that had to do with anything, I have no idea. The love affair of Doyle and Jean continued for 9 years prior to the death of Louisa in 1906. The second reason one might question Doyle's support for reform arises from not only his lack of support for, but in fact Doyle's outspoken and lifelong opposition to female suffrages in England. Although Doyle's unwavering support for divorce, later reform, and opposition to the female right to vote seems inconsistent, it appears that any self-serving purpose in Doyle sponsoring divorce reform is misplaced. The majority view is expressed by Charles Lingham as follows. Quote, the relationship had to survive great suffering. From the very first moment, Doyle told Jean he would not divorce his wife. He would never hurt her in any way, and he was devoted to Louise and emphatically would never, ever betray her sexually. For the rest of Louisa's life, he would neither marry nor sleep with Jean. Jean accepted this situation. Indeed, she had no wish to change the view, and Jean maintained that code of honor until Louisa's death. The family agreed that Louisa must never know about this. As far as we can tell, she never did. And as a final note to this remarkable tale, Doyle, a man in his prime, with normal desires, and denied their fulfillment, was on his way to a nervous breakdown. He tried to wear himself out by playing golf, which will do it, and cricket. It was unsuccessful. Nevertheless, Conan and Jean remained celibate until Louisa died. Cohen's 9-year abstinence during the courtship undoubtedly contributed to the engraving on the epitaph of Doyle's gravestone. Steel true, blade straight. Thank you. Now I'll stumble out of here.
Very funny.
Again, I'm sorry I'm taking all this time, but it takes me a little while to get started. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Up next is Matt Hall. Matt is in Australian by origin, but is now American, residing in Maryland, where he's a scientist for the National Institutes of Health, leading a drug discovery program for rare diseases. Matt has long been a devotee of Sherlock Holmes, but only discovered that there was a Sherlockian community about 7 years ago. He built up the courage to attend meetings just as COVID arrived. And he attended many Zoom meetings before his first Sherlockian in-person meeting at the 2022 Baker Street Irregulars Empire Conference in New York. He hasn't looked back. Matt's home society is the Red Circle of Washington, D.C., and he also attends Watson's Tin Box and Baltimore Sherlockian societies. This is his second year as a member of this program's faculty, and Matt will be speaking on Who Was R.T. Norman? Matt?
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be invited, and it's funny, I'd put the book up here on my title screen that you're holding. Hold on to it. One of them sold on eBay this week for about $150, so they're popular. Today I want to tell you about R.T. Norman. It's a story, it'll be published next year in the Baker Street Journal that I'm sharing for the first time in full. I did give a little preview talk at the Watson's Tin Box group earlier this year when I was doing the research. The March 1927 issue of the Strand magazine announced a competition set by Arthur Conan Doyle. Which are the best Sherlock Holmes stories? A novel competition set by A. Conan Doyle. Doyle had selected his best 12 stories from among the first 44 Sherlock Holmes short stories published and provided that sealed list to the editor of The Strand. As a little test of the opinion of the public, Doyle challenged readers to submit their list and see who could divine all of his 12 favorite stories. The winner would receive a £100 cash prize, and that's the big announcement you see here on the top line of the page. And they would also receive an autographed copy of Memories and Adventures. It was published in 1924. It was updated a few years later. A further 100 readers, the next 100 best guesses, would also receive an autographed copy of this book, but no prize money. Doyle stated, I've drawn up a list of the 12 short stories contained in the 4 published volumes, which I consider to be the best. The Strand article carried numbered illustrations from each of the eligible stories as sort of a visual aid to remind readers and help them select. So you can see, for example, under here, number 37, number 38, and each of them is accompanied by a Paget or other illustration as carried in the Strand. One item I desperately wanted to find, and I was glad I did, was an image of the entry coupon in the March 1927 issue. It was located cleverly for the publisher on page 68 of the advertising section. Turns out that when Strand copies were bound into hardcover volumes, the advertising section is removed. After search assistance from Sherlockians, including the Toronto Public Library, we'd had no luck. But Ira Matetsky made the ultimate sacrifice and took the risk of purchasing the one copy of the magazine available for sale. Thankfully, an enthusiastic fan had not torn out the coupon to enter the competition, and I can show you that here today for the first time. And so what people had to do was just write the numbers into these 12 boxes. The order of the stories was not judged, so they weren't in order. Conan Doyle just picked his favorite 12. But given these parameters, there are over 21 billion possible entry combinations. So this really is something of a lottery plus, I suppose, intellectually speaking. In some ways, the competition was an attempt by Doyle to draw a line under Sherlock. Along with the competition announcement was an article from Doyle to the readers, you can see here, reflecting on his creation of Sherlock and Sherlock's world, in which he optimistically states, "And so, reader, farewell to Sherlock Holmes. I thank you for your constancy and can but hope that some return has been made in the shape of that distraction from the worries of life and stimulating change of thought, which can only be found in the fairy kingdom of romance." Of course, he didn't stop writing stories after this. And 3 months later, the results were in. The June 1927 edition of The Strand announced that the prize of £100 has been won by Mr. R.T. Norman, Spring Hill, Wellingborough, Northants, which is Northamptonshire, who correctly named 10 stories of the 12, selected by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle as the best. You can see that highlighted up the top here. 7 entrants can correctly guess 9 of the stories, and many guessed 8, and the autographed books were distributed accordingly. The announcement was followed by a brief essay by Doyle rationalizing his selection of the best 12 Sherlock stories and sharing the list. And they're listed here. Just in case you can't see them, I'll quickly read them out for you. Speckled Band, Red-Headed League, Dancing Men, Final Problem, Scandal in Bohemia, The Empty House, 5 Orange Pips, Second Stain, Devil's Foot, Priory School, Musgrave Ritual, and the Reigate Squires. The list has been the source of much Sherlockian discussion and been collected and published with accompanying essays. For example, the Baker Street Dozen book that I show here, which is easily obtainable and a lot of fun, was published in 1989 and contains each of those stories with an accompanying essay, forwards by luminaries such as John Bennett Shaw and Bliss Austin. And through what seems like outrage at its exclusion from the original list, the book contains the bonus story of Silver Blaze, hence the Baker's Dozen. Doyle's list stimulated a number of other lists achieved by debate and voting, including by the Baker Street irregulars. So who was this victorious but seemingly anonymous R.T. Norman? Surely someone could best estimate Doyle's favorite stories as worthy of Sherlockian recognition. The Strand announcement didn't have a photo of him holding up the book or holding the check. Didn't have an interview with him or any comment. The only press attention was a brief note in Norman's local Northampton Mercury that provided really no other information other than what you can see here, that it was from Spring Hill and won the prize. He named 10 of 12. For Norman, it appears he had his 15 minutes of Sherlockian fame and a handy check worth about $5,000 in 2024. Just as a side note, I'm mentioning this place, Wellingborough. Where is it? It's in the East Midlands of England. It's shown here on these maps. So, London is roughly down here. You can have Oxford and Cambridge. And here's Wellingborough, the city, set in the county of Northamptonshire. So it's in the East Midlands. So I had to do some digging and some research. And so some of what I'm showing you here are the receipts to prove that the R.T. Norman I found is the R.T. Norman, but also to connect together and tell you a little bit about his life. He was born in 1888. Oh, okay. One sec. So research in these newspaper articles and official records means I can tell you that R.T. Norman's name was Raymond Thomas Norman. He lived from 1889 to 1956. And at the time of winning the competition, he was a lecturer in classics and ancient history at Durham University. He was born in 1888 at Wellingborough, exactly where he was when he won the prize. And you can see him entered here in the 1891 census. He's listed in here as a 2-year-old living with his father, who was a grocer. Just to point out, this occupation here is not a grocer's ass, but a grocer's assistant. Just want to make sure that's very clear. 10 years later, in 1901, the next census, you can see he's still living at home. He's aged 12. He's listed as TR, not RT, as a young child, but he's definitely RT later on. And the address here is Spring Hill. That's the name of the house he was living in. Newspaper notes show that he was educated at the Wellingborough School. He attended the University of London. He got a BA there in 1908 and an MA in 1913. And the 1911 census that I'm not showing here has him listed working as a schoolmaster in Kent College in Canterbury. When the war broke out, 1914, Norman was on the point of going to Oxford University, but he joined the Inns of Court Rifles in London and entered the Officer Training Corps. He was commissioned into the 7th Cheshires and served in Egypt and Palestine before being moved to France in 1918. There, he was transferred to the 102nd Light Trench Mortar Battery, and he was engaged in action on the Western Front in the last days of the war. In January 1919, the Midland Mail carried an announcement that he was RT Norman, as you can see the name as proper here, was awarded the Belgian Croix de Guerre for gallantry during the fighting at Menin and on the Scheldt in October 1918, really in the last days of the war. Following repatriation at the conclusion of the war, he enrolled in Balliol College at the University of Oxford, where he'd always wanted to go. He was known for his sporting prowess, represented both his county in tennis and field hockey, and he continued these activities at Oxford, where he earned a blue for hockey. Photographs from the Balliol College archives of the hockey 11 and the tennis 6 from 1919 to 1922 show a clean-shaven man, who I've highlighted, zoomed in here on the right for you, with an intense gaze and an athletic appearance. And I should point out, RT Norman was pretty much a mature-age student when he was at Oxford, making up for those lost war years. He was about 34 when he finally graduated from the University of Oxford. Along with this tennis 6 squad team here, there's a lovely photo of the field hockey team in their tweeds. There he is again on the right, focused in. And here he is in his actual sport field uniform for what you would call field hockey, and the rest of the world just calls hockey. Following graduation, he appears to have embarked upon a career as a lecturer in classics and ancient history at Durham that lasted about 30 years. Durham was the first university to open in England for more than 600 years after Oxford and Cambridge. So it was the third university. It was created around 1833, and it incorporates the historic Durham Castle. And so you can see again, London's down here, Northampton's here, and then he'd moved all the way up here to Durham. 1927 was probably the banner year for Norman. Along with winning £100 in a Sherlock competition, he married another Wellingborough local named Bessie Burkett. The newspaper announcement, which is long, carries an incredible wealth of information that really confirms that this is the correct RT Norman. Together, they had 2 daughters in the 1930s named Anne and Elizabeth, who was called Buffy by everybody, and lived in Durham, where he was working as a lecturer. A Durham University archives photo taken outside Durham Castle in 1927 shows 4 members of a dining club called the Slow Coach Club, which sounds like a lot of fun. And RT Norman is shown here, second from the left. Possibly his relaxed smile is a reflection of the prize money headed for the lunch table. Norman continued at Durham till he retired, living at 26 North Bailey, Durham. The 1939 register was created. It's not a census. It was really created to produce identity cards and ration books for wartime England once war was announced. There, he's listed with his family. You can see there he's Raymond with Bessie. The children are blocked off. They haven't got yet out of the confidentiality window. But he's a lecturer in ancient history and philosophy. He was very involved in Durham University life, writing articles, social and academic, in the pages of the Durham University Journal. After retirement, they relocated to 18 Hatton Avenue in Wellingborough, where he died suddenly in 1956, aged pretty young, 67 years old. He was cremated, and I haven't been able to identify a final resting place. Somewhere out there are 101 signed copies of Memories of Adventures, prizes from the Sherlock Holmes competition. It'll be interesting to know whether the inscriptions bear any specific reference to the competition. I haven't been able to unearth any copies sold or available for sale that would suggest that that's the case. We don't know if Norman was active in the foundational Sherlockian community, but I don't believe he was. Certainly no evidence exists in articles that are ever published by him on Doyle or Sherlock. But his success in the 1927 competition, predicting Conan Doyle's best stories, certainly warrants his recognition among Sherlockians. And it's been a real pleasure today to share with you who R.T. Norman was to the community. Thank you very much. That's right.
Thank you, Matt. The next speaker is Carla Coop, the London Bridge in the Baker Street Irregulars. Carla is also a member of the Adventuresses of Sherlock Holmes and many other Sherlockian societies. She's the editor of the Sherlock Holmes Mystery Magazine and has penned many pastiches, one of which was included in the Best American Mystery Stories of 2012. Carla is one of the past organizers of this program and did a superb job. And she's been a great deal of help to me. She will be speaking on Born to be a Man of Action. Carla?
Thank you. First, let's get the obvious out of the way. Yes, John Watson was a doctor, as was Conan Doyle. John Watson was a writer, a chronicler. Surprise, surprise, Conan Doyle made his name as an author. But the two men were even more closely paralleled as men of action. I think I went the wrong way. Aha, yay. Okay. As Holmes says in The Hounds of the Baskervilles, my dear Watson, you were born to be a man of action. Your instinct is always to do something energetic. This energy, this impetus toward action was shared by Conan Doyle throughout his life. Watson was always ready whenever Holmes required company, whether to tramp for miles along London streets, through the moors, or even in the Alps. He was ready with his old service revolver, either to fire it, or as he did with Colonel Sebastian Moran, to club him on the head with the butt. He would play billiards with Thurston. He'd grab the reins of a runaway horse, throw his weight against locked doors to burst them open, and almost die from poisonous fumes. He would agree to burglary and even make light of a bullet wound were they gained in a good cause. For Conan Doyle, action came in several forms. First and foremost, his love of sport. P.G. Wodehouse, the author of the Jeeves and Wooster stories, described him as immensely powerful in build and the keenest of sportsmen. A man of action indeed. As a youth, Conan Doyle considered himself a rough boy, pugnacious, but always in defense of the weak. In school, he enjoyed cricket, and this interest lasted throughout his life. In fact, he considered it a game which has, on the whole, given me more pleasure during my life than any other branch of sport. He even wrote a poem that commemorated taking a wicket over W.G. Grace, one of the premier cricketers of the time. It's not great poetry, but it begins, once in my heyday of cricket, one day I shall ever recall, I captured that glorious wicket, the greatest, the grandest of all. But his cricketing days were not all covered in glory, and there were unexpected dangers. Once he was playing against another excellent player whose fastball landed smack on Doyle's thigh. Pain blossomed, and when he looked down, he found his trousers on fire. He describes it, the ball landed straight on a small tin Vesta box in my trousers pocket, had splintered the box and set the matches ablaze. I mean, generally, when one speaks of an athlete being on fire, it's not meant literally. He was fond of boxing, considering the old prize ring an excellent thing from a national point of view. Rugby and football, soccer for Americans, were other favorites, although he was injured during a football match, which brought his football playing days to a close. For an aging man, Conan Doyle recommended, let him turn to golf and be thankful that there is still one splendid game which can never desert him. When visiting Rudyard Kipling in New England, he brought his golf clubs and gave Kipling a few lessons. Conan Doyle considered himself a fair hand at billiards, tried fencing, was an ardent bicyclist and horseback rider, and enjoyed cycling and motoring. And remember, these were the days when motoring was often a contact sport. In fact, Conan Doyle once overturned his car and was trapped underneath for some time. He also drove in the Prince Henry Tour race of 1911, which made its way through Germany and then Britain. Finally, skiing was the sport for which he received the most publicity. Despite plowing into snowbanks and ripping out the seat of his trousers coming down a steep slope, he loved the sport. You simply turn your long toes and let yourself go, gliding delightfully over the gentle slopes, flying down the steeper ones, taking an occasional cropper, but getting as near to flying as any earthbound man can. In that glorious air, it is a delightful experience. While he was skiing in Switzerland, one of its instructors listed Conan Doyle's profession as sportsman, and he was very proud of that title. In many ways, this was probably the most accurate characterization of Conan Doyle, or at least the one he most identified with. Conan Doyle's bent toward action was not just directed at sports, however. Like Watson, he was always ready for a new adventure. As a 20-year-old medical student in need of funds, he impulsively joined a whaling expedition, where he proceeded to fall into the freezing Arctic waters several times. Upon graduating from medical school, he signed up as the ship's doctor for the SS Mayumba, heading to Western Africa. And once off the coast of Ghana, he swam alongside the anchored ship. It was only when he was safely back on board did he see the shark fin cutting through the water he'd just left. Settling back in England, Conan Doyle set up a medical practice, but like Watson, found his true calling as a writer. Even after establishing himself as an author, Conan Doyle continued to yearn for adventure. So in 1895, he traveled to Egypt with his wife, spending his time touring, writing, riding, and playing golf. When open warfare with the Sudanese broke out, he managed to become an honorary war correspondent and was able to travel near the front lines. Unlike Watson's disastrous experience with the military, Conan Doyle said, "It was wonderful to look south and see distant peaks said to be in Dongola, with nothing but savagery and murder lying between." This was not a man who was content to stay at home during a conflict, even if he felt especially if he felt the cause was just. In 1900, he felt honor-bound to volunteer as a field surgeon during the Boer War in South Africa. For him, participating in war was a patriotic duty. Fair fight, open air, and a great cause. I know no better death. After the war ended, Conan Doyle, albeit somewhat reluctantly, received a knighthood for his war service. And this service resumed during the First World War, when, despite his age, he again became a war correspondent. Conan Doyle was never content to stick to his assigned role in society and was fearless when promoting ideas that would save lives or aid Britain during these conflicts. Name recognition brought attention to the many letters and pamphlets he penned. These advocated a number of causes, including materiel and process improvements for the fighting forces, and he also warned about potential threats. He was very vocal in his condemnation of the injustices taking place in the Congo, writing a long tract to support his cause. He also involved himself in several legal cases, including calling for the commutation of Roger Casement's sentence of death for treason, as well as the defense of George Adalji. Regarding Adalji, Conan Doyle said, "I realized that I was in the presence of an appalling tragedy and that I was called upon to do what I could to set it right." His indignation also rose in the case against Oscar Slater. It is an atrocious story, and as I read it and realized the wickedness of it all, I was moved to do all I could for the man. Holmes said in The Adventure of Abbey Grange, "Watson, you are a British jury, and I never met a man who was more eminently fitted to represent one." Much the same could be said of Conan Doyle, even from his pugnacious school days. He was never afraid to defend with spirit and vigor those less fortunate than himself. While Watson confined himself to the written word, Conan Doyle had honed his speaking skills through several lecture tours throughout the world, as well as unsuccessfully standing for Parliament twice. He effectively used the combination of print and podium through the years to bring attention to many topics, especially to one closest to his heart, spiritualism. In The Adventure of the Sussex Vampire, Holmes famously said, "No ghosts need apply." Our good Dr. Watson, however, was often influenced by the landscape and atmosphere of a place. And there are hints, quickly suppressed perhaps, but still discernible to the keen eye, that he would be more open to alternative explanations of these events. In this matter, Conan Doyle outbelieved Watson by several orders of magnitude. In fact, he called spiritualism far the most important thing in my life. This interest began in the 1880s and grew throughout the years, blossoming during World War I and strengthening throughout the rest of his life. He met Harry Houdini in 1920 through their shared interest in spiritualism, but Conan Doyle's uncritical acceptance of the claims of spiritualists led, within a few years, to a falling out between the two. Being such an ardent believer, he couldn't simply sit at home, quietly practicing his spiritualism. No, he had to become a missionary. Because of his experience in public speaking and writing persuasive essays, as well as his fame, he viewed himself as peculiarly suited to an evangelical role. In his later years, Conan Doyle wrote several books on spiritualist topics and went on worldwide lecture tours. Despite his growing ill health, Conan Doyle remained as active as ever, mounting a spirited defense of various mediums and a photographer who had been accused of fraud. With his forthright character and urge to leap into action at the slightest excuse, Conan Doyle resembled Watson in more than just appearance, a fact of which he was well aware and freely acknowledged. If Sherlock Holmes was modeled on Joseph Bell, Dr. John Watson shared many of Conan Doyle's characteristics, abilities, and interests. One day when I was scrolling through Tumblr, which is a niche social media site, yes, I see recognition among some people, mainly younger folks, I happened across a post from a user called Swamp Adder, who had just finished reading Conan Doyle's memories and adventures. Their final comment highlighted to me a major reason why Doyle created Watson, and why their characters are so closely connected. The idea of having this manic pixie dream detective come and snatch you away from your boring job that you hate and into a life of adventure is totally wish fulfillment. I, for one, as a reader, am immensely grateful that Conan Doyle chose, consciously or unconsciously, to create a character so like himself, to imbue Watson with his own sense of justice and his propensity to act directly and vigorously. Sir Arthur Charles Ignatius Conan Doyle was indeed a remarkable man of action. Thank you.
Thank you, Carla. The last speaker before the break is Brent Morris. Stephen Brent Morris worked his way through school as a performing magician. He is a mathematician by training and started his professional career as a cryptologist for 25 years with the National Security Agency. He has taught at Duke, Johns Hopkins, and George Washington universities, and has been invited to lecture at over 100 universities. For 17 years, he was the editor of the Scottish Rite Journal, the largest circulation Freemasonry magazine in the world. You may have seen him on the History or the Discovery Channel whenever they have a program about the Freemasons. He is also the author of The Idiot's Guide to Freemasonry. He is a past Gassagene of Watson's Tin Box of Ellicott City and a member of the Six Napoleons of Baltimore. Brent has published many Sherlockian articles, including a chapter in Out of the Abyss, the Baker Street Irregulars Press manuscript series book on the adventure of the empty house. Brent has emceed this program many times, and he will be speaking today on Conan Doyle and spiritualism. Brent?
Thank you, Andy. Actually, there's not a lot for me to say after Carla's last 5 minutes. That was really very nice, Carla. Historians refer to the period of roughly 1855 to 1930 as the Third Great Awakening. It was a time of religious as well as social activism. From this period emerged the Holiness, Nazarene, and Pentecostal movements, as well as Jehovah's Witnesses, Theosophy, Christian Science, and spiritualism. Spiritualism had a special attraction to Arthur Conan Doyle and influenced his life and writings in many ways. The fundamental ideas behind spiritualism are that, one, the spirits of the dead can communicate with the living, and two, that growth and perfection are possible in the spirit world. Thus, spirits are exceptionally suited to provide moral and ethical guidance, given their experience with other spirits on the other side. Spiritualists believe that spirit mediums are particularly gifted to communicate with spirits, but anyone can learn the skills through study and practice. A gathering to receive messages from spirits is known as a seance. Spiritualism is not a particularly well-organized belief system or religion, if you prefer. There is no formal dogma or creed, just a belief that the living can communicate with the spiritual world. Now, as a quick experiment, I did a Google search on the terms spiritualist church and Baltimore. What's going to happen? Google found 17 spiritualist churches within the Beltway. Yeah, surprising. One of these, however, one of these was City Church Presbyterian, affiliated with the Presbyterian Church of America. And that's probably not the type of church to be involved with mediums and seances. So I did a final Google search with spiritualism replacing spiritualist, and it yielded 8 churches within the Beltway and 2 just barely outside. Now, among these 10 churches is the Spiritist Society of Baltimore on West Padonia Road in Timonium. Their website says, quote, "Spiritism is a science which deals with the nature, origin, and destiny of spirits, as well as their relationship to the corporeal world." Okay, this is sounding a lot better, the type of thing I was looking for. They appear, however, to be they appear to be a Christian organization, as their website also says, Jesus is the guide and model for all humankind. The doctrine he taught and exemplified is the purest expression of God's will. What I concluded from this brief search is that spiritualism still exists. It can sort of be found, and it's probably nothing that can be fully explored in 15 minutes. So I said, okay, let's move on. Now, the American spiritualism movement began in 1848 with the Fox sisters of Rochester, New York. They were three sisters who claimed to communicate with spirits who made rapping sounds during the seances. The fact that observers could hear the spirits' communications enhanced the experience. This shared experience was much superior to messages whispered in the ear of the medium or simply left as thoughts in the medium's mind during sleep. The movement spread rapidly, as did the popularity of spirit rappings. You're in a darkened room. You're told to be very quiet. A question is asked, one rap for no, two raps for yes, and then suddenly you hear the raps, thunk, thunk, or thunk, as the case may be. It didn't even slow down much when Margarita, the middle sister, confessed in 1888 that the sisters made all the rapping sounds by cracking their toe joints. I don't like the idea of spending an evening cracking my toe joints. Ooh, once or twice, yeah, it kind of might feel good, but if you're doing this regularly, well, she confessed in 1888. Now, before that, disbelief had started to grow because the sounds, a careful listener could pinpoint where the sound was coming from, and it always seemed to come from under the dress of one of the sisters who was sitting on the stage. In fact, Margarita tried to rejoin the spiritualist movement. She recanted her confession because suddenly she had no form of employment. And she tried to return to mediumship and seances, but she was not nearly as successful now as she was before her confession. In fact, the spiritualism movement continued to grow despite Margarita's confession and the exposures of multiple other mediums. Arthur Conan Doyle, the subject of this conference, was born into an Irish Catholic family in Edinburgh, Scotland, on May 22nd, 1859. He was a boarding student at Stonyhurst College, a Jesuit school, and by the time he graduated at age 17, he had rejected Catholicism and embraced spiritualism. As early as January of 1880, while still a medical student, he wrote to his mother about a capital lecture he had attended entitled, "Does Death End It All?" It had been, quote, "a very clever thing indeed," he reported, "though not convincing to me." So here he is making a judgment of a spiritualist medium. Doyle is often reported as embracing spiritualism after the death of his eldest son, Kingsley, in 1918. That was from pneumonia after suffering a wound during World War I. And this is seen by some as an attempt at reconnecting with Kingsley and in some way reducing the pain of his loss. But the 1880 letter is evidence that he had been interested in the movement decades before the death of his son. He published a letter in an 1887 issue of Light, the Journal of the London Spiritual Alliance, which is further evidence of his long study of the subject. Indeed, he also joined the Society for Psychical Research the same year, which can be thought of as a public declaration of his interests, if not beliefs. In 1920, Doyle became friends with the famous magician Harry Houdini. Houdini had started something of a crusade to expose false mediums, both on and off the stage. And this, of course, was getting great publicity for Houdini and brought in crowds to hear him expose how the mediums were working. Now, in Doyle's company, Houdini feigned more openness to spiritualism than he truly possessed, because Houdini had no use for spiritualism or mediums.
He held his tongue during a seance in which Conan Doyle's wife, Jean, a medium who claimed to be skilled in automatic writing. In other words, the spirit would get in her, and then she would not of her own free will write out messages from the spirit. That's what automatic writing is. And she scribbled out a 5-page message, supposedly from Houdini's dearly departed mother. In fact, Houdini had once written that the crushing loss of his mother in 1913 set him on his single-minded search for a genuine spirit medium. But some Houdini experts argue otherwise. Now, after the session Houdini had with Jean Doyle, he privately concluded that Jean was not a true medium. And here was the problem. His Jewish mother, the wife of a rabbi, would not have drawn a cross atop the page of each message that she sent to her son. That just is not what she would have done. But that was the message that Jean delivered. Now, the pair's friendship became strained as Houdini's private opinion of Conan Doyle's spiritualist beliefs morphed into a public disagreement. The men spent years waging a Cold War in the press, doing lecture tours, and even before Congress, where Houdini's opinion of Conan Doyle as, quote, one of the greatest dupes, end quote, is preserved in a congressional hearing transcript. Perhaps one of the most telling moments for Doyle is what has come to be known as the Cottingley Fairies. You've probably seen these photographs. There are 5 photographs taken in 1917 by 2 cousins, aged 9 and 16, who lived in Cottingley near Bradford in England. Each photograph showed fairies, or in one case a winged gnome, in the wild. 4 of the photographs have a cousin posing with her mystical friends. The 5th one is only of fairies. The pictures came to the attention of writer Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who used them to illustrate an article on fairies he had been commissioned to write for the Christmas 1920 edition of the Strand magazine. Doyle seems to get a lot of notoriety from Christmas editions of magazines that he has articles in. Now, Doyle, as a spiritualist, was enthusiastic about the photographs, and he interpreted them as clear and visible evidence of psychic phenomena. Public reaction was mixed. Some accepted the images as genuine, others believed they had been faked. Think about what we're seeing today with artificial intelligence images. When you look at the Cottingley fairies, they look like little paper cutouts of carefully drawn fairies, and the girls are posed. In one case, there's a breeze in the background that is moving the leaves. You can see the blur of the leaves being moved, and the fairy is absolutely stationary. That may have been one of the powers of the fairies, that their light diaphanous gowns were not affected by wind like leaves around them. But Doyle accepted it. He was just, in my mind, very naive about it, and a lot of the public also. Now, in the early 1980s, some 60 years after the photographs were taken, the cousins Elsie and Francis admitted that the photographs were faked. So Doyle accepted them wholeheartedly. He put them in his book, and then the young ladies that took the photographs finally said 60 years later, yeah, these are fakes. They used cardboard cutouts of fairies copied from a popular children's book of the time. But Francis maintained that the 5th and final photograph of 2 fairies without girls in the background was genuine. As of 2019, the photographs and the cameras used are in the collection of the National Science and Media Museum in Bradford, England. So if you'd like to see the originals, you can go to Bradford and see them yourself. Now, next to Sherlock Holmes, Professor George Edward Challenger is probably Doyle's most famous character. I remember as a kid watching The Lost World as a movie, and that was so cool with the dinosaurs. And in fact, we can attribute, The Lost World as the source and origin of most of the dinosaur movies that we watch today. The idea is that on an island or in some separated place, the dinosaurs have continued and we can find them. It doesn't, now, Challenger does not appear to have, does not appear in nearly as many stories as Holmes. But for what it's worth, Challenger appears with more dinosaurs than Holmes. The Land of Mist, published in 1926, is the third and last of the Challenger novels. And there were 2 short stories, so it's a very small canon for Professor Challenger. Doyle uses this novel, The Land of Mist, as a soapbox to promote spiritualism. And that's the only conclusion you can come to, or that I could come to, as I was reading sections of The Land of Mist. This is just a soapbox, and everything is being set up to, you know what the answers are going to be, that spiritualism is real. So I just spoiled the book for you, but Doyle uses it as his soapbox, and then and what he considers the proper way to research spiritual phenomenon. And one of the things that he objected to was that some of the scientists that were studying spiritualism did not approach it in a neutral or believing manner. They approached it in a manner that said it was not true. I remember back in grad school, a famous problem at that time, it stood for 500 years, called Fermat's last theorem. And it was not uncommon for amateurs to send solutions to the math department. And one professor had a form letter made that said, "Dear sir, your first or dear sir or madam, the first mistake occurs on page blank and line blank." And then he would hand that to his grad students whenever a proof came in and said, "Here, fill in the page number and line where the mistake occurs," without even reading the proof. He was so confident it was wrong. Well, at the beginning of The Land of Mist, a character named Algernon Maley is describing various guests arriving for a seance. And he's asked, "And the man in the horn glasses?" And Algernon replies, "That is a pompous ass named Weatherby. He is one of those who wander about the obscure edges of masonry, talking with whispers and reverence of mysteries where no mystery is. Spiritualism, with its very real and awful mysteries, is to him a vulgar thing because it brought consolation to common folk. But he loves to read papers on the Palladian cultus, the ancient and accepted Scottish rites, and the Baphometic figures." Now, an investigation is needed to study the reality of the spirit world, all conveniently set up by Doyle in The Land of Mist. An investigation is needed to study the reality of the spirit world. And this is all conveniently set up by Doyle in a haunted house with an apparition. So his characters have to visit the haunted house, they see a ghost, and they say, "Aha, we need to study this." And Challenger joins the investigation, ostensibly to demonstrate the fallacies of psychic research. But he becomes convinced of the reality of intercourse with the spirits of the dead and announces his conversion in a polemic carried by the Spectator magazine. So this is sort of the climax of the book, and this is what Doyle is building up for his readers, that you've got to study spiritualism right, and when you do, even a crude person like Professor Challenger. Challenger was a genius, but he was just a bull in a china shop. Even he can be converted to spiritualism. Now, Doyle's belief in spiritualism can be challenging to his readers, especially when some phenomena he accepted as real have later been shown to be hoaxes. You can think of someone who accepts all of the AI images that they find on the internet as being real. That's the way I felt about it. However, Doyle was straightforward in his approach to life, and he was straightforward in his approach to his beliefs. He said, let's look at this phenomenon. Let's look at it from a neutral point of view. Let's examine it and see what we find. That approach is admirable. And his epitaph reflects it well. Carly didn't read the whole thing, so at least I have one line left. Steel true, blade straight, Arthur Conan Doyle, knight, patriot, physician, and man of letters. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brent. We're now going to take a short 15-minute break. During the break, you can obtain postcards about the theater party hosted by the Red Circle from Peter Blau or Carla Koop. If you'd like to learn more about the books available from Baker Street Irregulars Press, you can speak with me. If you'd like to learn more about the Baltimore Sherlockian societies, there are business cards and postcards out on the table out there. I highly recommend that those of you who have your tuchuses in the seats and those of you who are watching us on the streaming come back after the break, because our last two speakers are Daniel Stashauer and Karen Wilson, and we'll have an inquisition of the audience, the winner of which, I'm afraid the streamers won't be able to get this, is a $25 gift card. So please come back, and otherwise we'll take a 15-minute break now. Thank you.
I almost bought the tickets, even though we couldn't eat the food or vegan, and the food was very traditional. It sounded like it would be amazing. But I thought, maybe I could just go and have a drink and book the building. Listen, right? Sounds gorgeous. You get dressed up for that. Yeah, I would think so. The tradition of it might be just.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to reconvene. Okay.
Right now. Exactly.
A couple of announcements before we start. First of all, Peter Kaplan has one copy left of a pastiche that heavily goes into the history of Holmes and the medical college, Bart's. So if you want, you can see him right there. Second of all, again, I want to thank JP, who's doing our tech and doing a wonderful job. He informs me that in addition to those of you who are here today, there are 21 people who are streaming us on either YouTube or the Pratt's Facebook page, and that a copy of the program will remain on the page after this. So you can go back and take a look. Daniel Stashower, Thurston in the Baker Street Irregulars, is a prolific New York Times bestselling author whose books include, listen to this, The Ectoplasmic Man, The Dime Store Murders, The Houdini Spectre, Elephants in the Distance, The Beautiful Cigar Girl, or Edgar Allan Poe and the Murder of Mary Rogers, Teller of Tales, the best biography of Conan Doyle, The Boy Genius and the Mogul, Conan Doyle, A Life in Letters, The Hour of Peril, and most recently, American Demon. He is a good friend both to me personally and to this program, at which he has spoken several times. Daniel will discuss Conan Doyle and Howard Thurston. Daniel?
Thank you, JP. Howard Thurston, widely known as the Dean of American Magicians, came to prominence in magic's golden age. This was the era when the ornate and stately magic of the Victorian era gave way to the electrified glitz of vaudeville. And for some 40 years, Thurston held audiences spellbound with a parade of startling illusions that came to be known as the wonder show of the universe. Like many magicians, Thurston presented an wildly fanciful account of his own early life. He claimed that he had been stolen by the Mohammedans in Algiers at the tender age of 3 and schooled in the mystic arts. In fact, he spent his early years living rough a street urchin, if you will, eventually falling in with a gang of thieves in New York's notorious Bowery district. It is said that his compact size made him useful for shoving through doorway transoms. And once he was inside, he would unlock the door from the inside and let his fellow ragamuffins in. These contrasting extremes, the young mystic on the one hand, the ragamuffin thief on the other, were captured in a favorite catchphrase of his later career: "I wouldn't deceive you for the world." It was here in Baltimore on May 16th, 1908, that Thurston assumed the mantle of the world's greatest magician from the illustrious Harry Keller. This came at a time when the title of world's greatest magician was a hard-won commodity and a jealously guarded one. It was natural then that Thurston would cross paths and occasionally butt heads with Harry Houdini, who also fancied himself the world's greatest magician. And perhaps it was also inevitable, when Houdini began his ill-fated friendship with Arthur Conan Doyle in the early 1920s, that Howard Thurston should appear on the periphery, as if in a puff of smoke. In 1922, Conan Doyle was Houdini's guest of honor in New York at the Society of American Magicians annual banquet. This was the occasion when Conan Doyle showed film footage of the dinosaurs from the forthcoming Lost World film, resulting in this New York Times headline, "Dinosaurs Cavort in Film for Doyle." Howard Thurston also cavorted that evening, and he would have left a powerful impression on Conan Doyle in every sense. At one point during the banquet, Thurston grasped Conan Doyle's nose between two fingers and produced a spurting cascade of playing cards from the famous author's nose. Conan Doyle's response to this curious effect is lost to history. But when it came to Conan Doyle, Thurston was on the nose in many respects. Like Houdini, Thurston professed at the beginning to be open-minded about spiritualistic matters. Thurston appears to have meant it. In a private letter to Houdini, he wrote, "I am very particular to have you know how I stand on this matter. I do believe in spiritualism." Conan Doyle took note. In Our American Adventure, he singled Thurston out for praise. He wrote, "Mr. Howard Thurston, who is, next to Houdini, the chief magician in America, has shown great patience and acumen in investigating mediums. He has naturally found fraud, but he has also admitted that he has several times encountered real psychic gifts, which are in a different category to tricks. By this admission, he has placed himself in an enlightened band, who number several of the greatest magicians of the past." But then, suddenly, Houdini died, and the landscape shifted, especially in the world of spiritualism. Houdini had always believed that if anyone could find a way to pierce the veil of death, it would be him, the great Houdini. And in the days following his death, spiritualists around the world went on high alert. Houdini's widow, Bess, told reporters of a secret code word that her husband had promised to deliver from the other side, if such were possible, so as to guard against the possibility of fraud. Soon, a prominent medium stepped forward with a message purporting to have come from Houdini containing the secret code word. The story created an international sensation. Bess Houdini even sent a cable to Conan Doyle, who shared the glad tidings with the press. As it turns out, Houdini's return from the dead was short-lived. Bess Houdini quickly recanted upon being reminded that the code had appeared in print a short time earlier. At the same time, Thurston made an energetic play to assume Houdini's mantle as an anti-spiritualist crusader, even launching a fresh investigation of the famous Marjorie the Medium, which was a storied episode in Houdini's career. Thurston still professed to be open-minded when it came to the spirit realm, but it would not have escaped his notice that exposing fake mediums was very good for business. It raised his profile, and it established him as a peer of Houdini and Conan Doyle. Conan Doyle, for his part, was not amused. Within a year, newspapers were reporting a pretty quarrel between the American wizard and the famous author. Conan Doyle was indignant at being branded gullible and easily fooled for his beliefs. He said, "I have nothing to say, really, about Mr. Thurston. Am I easily fooled? Was it not I who got Oscar Slater out of jail? Did I not get Adelgy out of jail? Who was being fooled then?" Possibly, Conan Doyle was incensed at a new feature added to Thurston's act, in which the magician professed to reproduce the effects of the spiritualists. One of the demonstrations was called Conan Doyle Outdone. The feud dragged on for a few years, and somehow it survived the deaths of both men. Soon after Conan Doyle's passing, in July of 1930, as Jean Conan Doyle spoke to the press about spirit messages received from her husband, Thurston was quick to shoot down her claims. "I do not want to cast any reflection on Mrs. Doyle," he said, "because I believe she is sincere, and she feels the message is genuine. But," he added, "the message was trickery, nothing but trickery." Howard Thurston passed away in April of 1936, but even in death, he was not quite ready to give up the spotlight. In his final years, he spoke of having formed a pact with Houdini, Conan Doyle, and others to hold a reunion beyond the grave. Taking a leaf from the Houdini playbook, Thurston mentioned a special code word to be sent back to the land of the living. Jean Conan Doyle, Sir Arthur's widow, was not having it. She issued a statement expressing irritation at the magician's use of her husband's name to gain publicity. The headline read, "Lady Conan Doyle, tired of humbugs." Tired of humbugs, a lovely phrase. So where does this leave us? I stand before you as a man who is invested as a Baker Street irregular under the title of Thurston. At the same time, I'm a Conan Doyle biographer and sympathetic to the great man's beliefs, even if I don't subscribe to them myself. For me, the pressing question is whether Thurston played fair with Conan Doyle. In other words, was Thurston a believer or an opportunist? I'm struck by a comment he made to an audience of believers at New York's first spiritualist church. Ultimately, he said, "I'm trying to get into heaven, just as you are." But, as no less a figure than W.C. Fields once remarked, Howard Thurston's a great man, only one I ever knew, with complete confidence in his own con. Or, as another great man tells us, you know, a conjurer gets no credit when once he has explained his trick. So in the end, we must circle back to the words of Thurston himself. My object is to mystify and entertain, he liked to say. I wouldn't deceive you for the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. You know, I have to say, I have something in common with the people that Daniel spoke about. I have designed and paid for my own gravestone for after I pass. And one of the things I have on the gravestone is an epitaph that says, "I'll signal you if Sartre was wrong." Our next and last speaker is Karen Wilson, Bartholomew Wilson, in the Baker Street Irregulars. She is also a member of the Adventuresses of Sherlock Holmes. She is a Baltimore area philosophy professor, church musician, Sherlockian, and grandma. Currently, she is the Gassagene of the Six Napoleons of Baltimore. She's also a member of the Sherlockians of Baltimore and Watson's Tin Box, of which he was a past Gassagene. She is co-editor of According to My Notes, a wonderful book of essays on Sherlock Holmes and music, published by the Baker Street Irregulars Press and available at bakerstreetirregulars.com. Today, Karen will address Conan Doyle at the Wicket. Karen?
I'm low tech, but I need to set up my paper. All right. Good afternoon. I am especially flattered to have been included on today's program because I'm really more of a Sherlockian than a Doylean. Still, while I can't claim to be an expert, I think that on a day meant to honor the Victorian Edwardian historical novelist, statesman, physician, and sportsman, my standing before you, adorned in Holmes-themed jewelry and a battery of Sherlockian fangirl pins, wearing a deerstalker, is exactly what he would have wanted, right? Well, Sir Arthur, if it's not, knock 3 times. Okay, we're good. My topic today links 2 subjects that do, in fact, interest me a great deal: the creator of the Sherlock Holmes stories and the storied sport of cricket. I discovered the noble game in the year 2000 when home internet access brought many things far away suddenly nearer. And though I'm unathletic, I'm very attracted to the notion of sport as metaphor and social mirror, so I dived right into cricket's history and was rewarded to learn, among other things, one of the coolest trivia facts connecting any sport to literature. At the center of the anecdote in question, which you've already heard today but will hear again, is our man Doyle. And so I've assembled some other fun facts to go along with that for a title that I have entitled, or rather a talk I have entitled Conan Doyle at the Wicket. Now, however poorly informed one is about the game's finer points, many folks, Anglophiles in particular, will know cricket as the bat and ball sport whose history and traditions embody many of the most quintessential aspects of the nation that spawned it. These include some very charming features, such as the inclusion of a tea break as part of the official partitioning of a day's play in the longer version of the game, as well as a colorful, homely vocabulary that seems straight out of Monty Python. For example, in cricket, one might bowl a maiden over, get out for a duck, or a golden duck, or even a diamond duck, make a dolly catch, stand at the popping crease or at deep cover, cow corner, or my favorite, silly mid-off. One might face or bowl a googly, a flipper, or a dibbly-dobbly, and even be deemed a bunny. When a man has got out, the fielding side must request the umpire to dismiss him with a cry of, "How's that?" How's that? The original question. At the same time, if a man knows he is out, he's supposed to sportingly walk back to the pavilion without needing to be dismissed. How very, very British. But there's a less endearing side to the noble game's history, embodying as it did the racism, classism, and colonialism of the empire in which it grew up, all, alas, also very, very British. The classism, which one also saw in the modern Olympic movement, was reflected in a largely bogus distinction drawn between the gentleman amateur and the professional player of the game. And the colonialism resulted in cricket's ending up a game which is even more popular in some Commonwealth countries than in the country of its origin, where it has been supplanted by football as the most popular national sport. There's a reason that Ted Lasso wasn't about an American crossing the pond to coach a cricket club. Joking to a British audience in 1987, the late, great Robin Williams famously referred to the sport as baseball on Valium. He was alluding not only to the fact that the classic version of the game, a test match, can last for 5 days and often results in a draw, but also to the leisurely pace of the game, even for a bat and ball sport. Because a batsman doesn't have to strike, we'd say swing at, a ball that's delivered to him, and because he doesn't have to run even when he does hit the ball, he can extend his time at the crease even longer than a baseballer who keeps hitting foul after 2 strikes. The cricket batsman keeps scoring until he's out, so that in a really good innings, the same batsman might be up for hours. However, while baseball on Valium is a great line, it not only fails to characterize some of the more fast-paced variations of cricket, but in my humble opinion, it also does an injustice to the classic version. Because one might just as easily call cricket baseball on steroids. Think of it this way. Each of the 2 teams fields 11, not 9 players. 2 batsmen, not 1, are up at the same time. While only one is the striker, if he hits it well, both of them run. There are also 2 bowlers on call at the same time, taking it in turns to each offer a 6 delivery over from his respective end of the pitch. The game's played in 360 degrees so that any direction is fair, and a person who knocks one out of the park gets 6 runs added to his total. Batsmen can score in the hundreds. Teams routinely do the same, and a classic test match, as we said, is played over 5 days. Even the shorter version of the game played in the World Cup can last for a full 8-hour day. Cricket is a big game. So a little history. The earliest known mention of adults playing cricket dates from the early 17th century, when 2 men are listed in ecclesiastical records as having been fined for missing church on a Sunday to play cricket. And its association with church skipping and gambling made it a target of Puritan preaching, but after the restoration of the monarchy, the game gained popularity. In 1787, the Marylebone Cricket Club, aka the MCC, was founded and Lord's Cricket Ground was open. The club soon rose to preeminence and became the custodian of the laws of the game. And in the 19th century, Doyle's time, the organization of the game that would endure into the modern era took shape. Cricket had come to the Americas with the British, and as empire spread, the game was introduced to Australia and Southeast Asia. The first international cricket match was played, interestingly, between a Canadian and an American side in 1844. In 1862, an English team made its first tour of Australia, and in 1876 and 77, the first test match series was played in Australia between that country and England, giving rise to a rivalry that became known in 1882 and remains known to this day as the Ashes. Meanwhile, in 1865, at the tender age of 17 years old, the great W.G. Grace, like Conan Doyle, a doctor by profession, well, eventually, not at 17, began his long career becoming the game's first superstar. And in 1890, county club cricket, the major league version of the sport, was founded. Now, where was Arthur Conan Doyle during all of this? Well, he was right there with what you might call a front row seat, except he wasn't seated in the stands, but playing on the pitch. Born in 1859, Arthur took up the game at Stonyhurst, making the third string 11, or the third 22, I think it was called, in 1873. He never crawled higher during his time there than the second 11. But over the course of the next 30 years, he played in 449 matches for clubs including Portsmouth, the Hampshire Rovers, Norwood, the Authors Cricket Club, J.M. Barrie's Alla Hackberries Club, and yes, the mother side, the Marylebone Cricket Club. He even played with the Stonyhurst Old Boys, a wandering team, right after his wedding in 1885. The team went on a tour to Ireland. It is not known whether Louise accompanied him. 10 of the matches Doyle played between 1900 and 1907 were ruled as first-class matches, and his entry in the official record book credits him, with respect to those 10 matches, with 231 runs, a batting average of 19.25. He bowled 16 overs, allowing 50 runs and taking 1 wicket. That means bowling 1 player out, about which more in a moment. Doyle was, in the parlance of the game, an all-rounder, someone who could both bat and bowl. And upon his death in 1930, the Wisden Cricketer's Almanac, which is the Bible of the sport, published an obituary characterizing him thusly: although never a famous cricketer, he could hit hard and bowl slows with a puzzling flight. It's interesting in the light of all this that cricket figures so little in the canon, with just a few bare mentions. There's young Lord Saltire's cricket cap, a clue in The Adventure of the Priory School. In The Adventure of the Three Students, Gilchrist is said to play cricket for his college. In The Adventure of the Naval Treaty, Percy Phelps is said to have been tormented by his fellow students at school who chased him about brandishing a wicket. So that would be I presume, the stump, the long vertical piece of that wicket that is seen behind the batsman and that is the target of the bowler in cricket. There's a near miss in The Sign of 4. Toby leads Holmes and Watson to Kennington Lane on the east of the Oval, a famous cricket ground, but they don't go in. We could count the extra-canonical How Watson Learned the Trick, where Holmes admits to checking out the cricket page in the newspaper to see how Surrey was doing against Kent. But that's not much. Some have theorized that Sherlock's name was inspired by the names of 2 cricketers. There was a cricketer called Frank Shacklock, who incidentally played with another man named William Mycroft for Derbyshire against the MCC in 1885, 2 years before the publication of the first Sherlock Holmes story. But this Shacklock had also played with another well-known county cricketer, Mordecai Sherwin, in Nottinghamshire. And Sherwin was a wicket-keeper, that's like a catcher, and Shackleford a bowler. And so they got a lot of people out together, and the call would be, "Caught Sherwin, bowled Shacklock." Again, so possibly a source of Sherlock, though we don't know. Doyle doesn't confirm it, and in fact, he went to school at Stonyhurst with somebody by the name of Sherlock, and also some brothers by the name of Moriarty, and he was an in-law, I think, or related by marriage to someone of the name Sherlock, so who knows? So it doesn't make it much into canon. But there were a few short stories. He wrote a couple of non-Holmesian short stories with a cricketing theme, one based on a spectacular ball that had once got him out, not the one that set him afire. There were a few nonfiction articles, including a 1915 piece entitled The Greatest of Cricketers, which was a tribute to the greatest of cricketers, W.G. Grace. Better known is Doyle's 1909 Strand piece, Some Recollections of Sport, though in it he names rugby football as his pick for the best team sport. He does devote 8 full paragraphs there to the noble game. And one of these is an anecdote you've already heard today, in which he shares about a ball that hit him right in the pocket, where he'd already stored a box of matches, and therefore it not only got him out, but set him afire. He also shared, and this is the fun fact that tickled me so much when I first learned it, a becomingly self-effacing full paragraph account of his greatest achievement as a bowler, the taking of that single aforementioned first-class wicket, which, as you've already heard today, was not just any man's wicket, but that of the great W.G. Grace. To be sure, it was a 52-year-old W.G. in the last decade of his storied career, but Doyle himself was 41, playing for the MCC, when he faced his fellow cricketing doctor in that match in 1900. And as he notes, 4 first-class professionals had preceded him in trying to get the great man out, but had done nothing against Grace's impenetrable defense. Doyle theorizes here that he was the one to do the job, maybe because given his lesser skills, WG might have let his guard down a little. It also helped that the wicketkeeper who caught Grace's poor hit of Doyle's delivery had good hands. But it was Doyle, the bowler, who got the credit. That moment of supreme good fortune, he concluded, atoned for many a missed chance and many a day's pounding on a hard wicket. Now, to imagine how special this is, I don't know. Think of Ernest Hemingway striking out Babe Ruth. That's what's going on here. And Doyle was suitably impressed with his achievement, enough to write a doggerel epic, of which you have seen the first stanza today. But wait, there's more. And it is with that poem that I would like to conclude. And with apologies to the ghost of Doyle, except not really because I couldn't resist, I will be singing it to you. The tune, which I have borrowed from another Sherlockian context, fitted perfectly. And so I would crave indulgence from that setting, except I'm not really sorry. All right, now one more thing, and I think it will help in what follows, to imagine Dr. Grace as being played by the great Brian Blessed in his prime, colossal, full-bearded, and larger than life. The wicket keeper, Storer, who has his moment at the end, I always imagine as being played by a younger James Cromwell. The casting of Doyle I shall leave as an exercise to the listener. Here then, a reminiscence of cricket. Once in my heyday of cricket, one day I shall ever recall, I captured that glorious wicket, the greatest, the grandest of all. Before me he stands like a vision, bearded and burly and brown, a smile of good-humored derision as he waits for the first, that's Doyle's first ball bowled, to come down. A statue from Thebes or from Knossos, a Hercules shrouded in white, a Syrian built like Colossus. He stands there in all of his might, with the beard of a Goth or a Vandal, his bat hanging ready and free, his great hairy hands on the handle, and his menacing eyes upon me. And I had tricks for the rabbits. The rabbits are the ones you know you can get out. The feeble of mind or of eye, I could see all the duffer's bad habits, and just where his ruin might lie. The capture of such might elate one, but it seemed like a horrible jest that I should serve tosh, that's Doyle's assessment of his own bowling, to the great one who had broken the hearts of the rest. At this point, he'll describe each of the 3 balls he delivered. Well, here goes. Good Lord, what a rotter. Such a sitter as never was dreamt. It was clay in the hands of the potter, but he tapped it with quiet contempt. The second was better, a little. It was low, but was nearly long hop. As the housemaid comes down on the beetle, so down came the bat with a chop. He was sizing me up with some wonder, my broken-kneed action and ways. I could see the grim menace from under the striped peak that shaded his gaze. The third was a gift, or it looked it, a foot off the wicket or so. His huge figure swooped as he hooked it. His great body swung to the blow. Still, when my dreams are nightmarish, I picture that terrible smite. It was meant for a neighboring parish or any place well out of sight. But, yes, there's a but to the story. The blade, that's the bat, swished a little too low. Oh, wonder and vision of glory. It was up like a shaft from a bow. Up like a towering game bird, up to the speck in the blue, and then coming down just like the same bird, dead straight on the line that it flew. Good Lord, it was mine, such a sorer would call for a safe pair of hands, none safer than Derbyshire's storer. There, face uplifted, he stands. Wicket keeps storer, the knowing, wary and steady of nerve, watching it falling and growing, marking the pace of the curve. I stood with my 2 eyes fixed on it, paralyzed, helpless, inert. There was plunk as the glove shut upon it, and he cuddled it up to his shirt. Out beyond question or wrangle. Homeward he lurched to his lunch. His bat was tucked up at an angle, his great shoulders curved in a hunch. Walking, he rumbled and grumbled, scolding himself and not me. One glove was off and he fumbled, twisting the other hand free. Did I give Storer the credit, the thanks he so splendidly earned? It was mere empty talk if I said it, for grace had already returned.
Okay, so thank you very much, Karen. And you can see why Karen is a frequent speaker here and a frequent speaker, frankly, up and down the East Coast among Sherlockians. It is now time, and thank you to all of our faculty today. It is now time for the Inquisition of the audience. Each of the members of the faculty who spoke today will ask 2 questions, and you will write down the answers, and then we'll add up how many points people got, and the winner will receive a $25 gift card. Now, is there anybody who needs something on which to write? Because I did bring some index cards. Peter, you want to come up and get one? Do you think that I'm thinking that the faculty can actually stay in their seats. You don't have to come up. You can yell out what your question is, and I will repeat it if necessary, if I hear it. So the first speaker is Peter Blau. Peter, you want to ask your 2 questions?
Okay. How many Conan Doyles were there? The second question is, how many of them did I know?
How many Conan Doyles were there? It's the first question. And how many did Peter know is the second question. Dan, Thomas, you want to ask your 2 questions?
What was the epitaph that was carved into the gravestone of Conan Doyle?
Okay, what is the epitaph that's carved into the gravestone of Conan Doyle? And the second question? What is the Latin expression for an absolute divorce? The next, Carla.
Which sport did Conan Doyle think was appropriate for the aging man?
Which sport did Conan Doyle think was appropriate for the aging man?
And name 2 of the legal cases Conan Doyle became involved in.
Name 2 of the legal cases in which Conan Doyle became involved. Brent, you want to ask 2?
Yes. What was the family name of the 3 sisters who started the spiritualism movement with spirit wrappings?
What was the name of the 3 sisters who started the spiritualism movement with the spirit wrappings? and I was tempted to knock on. The second question.
Second question. What famous magician was not impressed by a spirit letter from his mother?
What famous magician was not impressed by a spirit letter from his mother? Daniel Stashauer.
Howard Thurston was christened the world's greatest magician here in Baltimore. What was the name of the magician who passed on the mantle?
Howard Thurston was christened the world's greatest magician here in Baltimore. And what was the name of the magician who passed on the mantle? Second question.
Sir Arthur would have been incensed by one of the effects in Thurston's spiritualist routine. What was the name of that effect?
Sir Arthur would have been incensed by one of the effects of in Thurston's spiritualist routine. What was that effect? And Ms. Wilson.
Who, Wicket, did Conan Doyle take in his only first-class Wicket? Number one. Number two, how many canonical Sherlock Holmes stories mention cricket or cricketing accessories?
Don't forget Matt.
I did, Matt. I apologize.
That's okay. That gave me more time to think. What year was the Arthur Conan Doyle story competition in the Strand?
In what year was the Arthur Conan Doyle story competition in the Strand?
And what was the extra story added to the Baker Street dozen?
And what was the extra story mentioned, included in the Baker Street dozen publication? Okay. Answers, let's start. Peter.
Well, the first answer of the four answers is there were 6 Conan Doyle. Arthur Conan Doyle has 5 children. But if you say 10, I'll accept that because he included 2 wives, and the wives were Dennis and Adrian. Now, if you said 6 Conan Doyles, then I knew 2 of them, Adrian and Dame Jean. If you said 10, then I knew 3, and Dennis's wife.
Does anyone need me to repeat all that? Okay, next, Dan.
The Latin for an absolute divorce is avinculo matrimona,
Avinculo matrimona.
and the epitaph on the gravestone, steel, true, blade, straight.
Steel true, blade straight. I'm looking for the I don't want to skip anybody again. Matt.
All right. 1927 was the year of the story competition. And Silver Blaze was the extra story added to the Baker Street dozen when they were published.
Okay. 1927 and Silver Blaze. Carla.
Okay, what sports did Conan Doyle think appropriate for the aging man? Golf. And name 2 of the lead cases Conan Doyle became involved in. There's Casement, Dalgy, Slater, divorce, which I didn't mention, but you might have picked it up from someone else, and the Congo. 2 of any of those would work.
Brent.
It was the Fox sisters. It started the spiritualist movement with their wrappings. And then it was Harry Houdini who was not impressed with the message sent to his mother.
The Fox sisters and Harry Houdini. Daniel Stashauer.
Harry Keller was the name of the magician who passed on the mantle of world's greatest. And Sir Arthur would have been incensed by the effect in Thurston's repertoire called Conan Doyle Outdone.
Karen.
The single first-class wicket that Doyle took along, of course, to W.G. Grace. And there are 3 canonical tales that mention cricket or cricketing equipment. That was the Priory School, the 3 students, and the Naval Treaty.
Anybody need me to repeat that?
Didn't you mention it was 4th with the cricket ground?
I mentioned that in the sign of the 4, they get close to a cricket ground. The word cricket isn't named, but if you said 4 on the thought of that they got within spitting distance of the oval, sure, give yourself credit.
Okay. All right. You have all the answers. Please total your score. There were 14 questions. Did anybody get all 14 questions correct? 13. 12. 11. 10. 9. There you go. We have a winner. Come up after the program and you'll go ahead. Raise you. Stand up and please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Megan. I came with Lynn from the Naval Treaty, big Sherlockian fan.
And I will say that Megan is a very good listener. She has won the Inquisition before. So congratulations to Megan. I want to thank all of the faculty of this year's Pratt Library program. I want to thank the people at the Pratt with whom I worked to organize this. And join us again next year as we'll be celebrating the 46th anniversary of this program. Till then, I wish you my best Sherlockian regards. Thank you.